Hissène Habre. Hissène Habre ruled Chad from 1982 to 1990 with extreme brutality, earning him the nickname Africa's Pinochet. He came to power through a coup backed by the United States and France, who saw him as a counterforce to Libya's Muammar Gaddafi. Once in power, Habre unleashed a reign of terror, targeting political opponents, ethnic groups, and civilians. His secret police, the Documentation and Security Directorate, DDS, carried out mass executions, torture, and forced disappearances. An estimated 40,000 people were killed, and over 200,000 were imprisoned or tortured. The infamous Les Locaux prison was used for horrific torture methods, including electric shocks, sexual violence, and starvation. Habre's ethnic cleansing campaigns particularly targeted the Sara, Hajarai, and Zagawa groups, leading to massacres. His reign of terror ended in 1990 when he was overthrown by Idriss Déby and fled to Senegal. For decades, he evaded justice, but in 2016, he became the first former African leader to be convicted of crimes against humanity by an African court. He was sentenced to life in prison but died in 2021 while serving his sentence. His brutal rule remains one of the darkest chapters in Chad's history. Idi Amin. Idi Amin came to power through a military coup in 1971, overthrowing President Milton Obote. Initially welcomed by Ugandans, his rule quickly became one of the most brutal in African history. Amin established a dictatorship based on fear, ethnic cleansing, and extreme violence. He ordered the massacre of an estimated 300,000 to 500,000 people, including intellectuals, political opponents, and members of ethnic groups he distrusted, notably the Akoli and Langi. He expelled 60,000 Asians from Uganda in 1972, which led to economic collapse as they had controlled much of Uganda's trade and business. Amin's rule was characterized by extreme paranoia. He reportedly had opponents thrown into the Nile River to be eaten by crocodiles and was accused of cannibalism. His notorious State Research Bureau, SRB, acted as a secret police force, abducting, torturing, and killing thousands. Uganda's economy suffered under his mismanagement, and he spent lavishly while the country starved. He also engaged in bizarre behavior, such as declaring himself the King of Scotland and giving himself the title His Excellency President for Life. Field Marshal Al-Haji, Dr. Idi Amin Dada, VC, DSO, MC, conqueror of the British Empire. His rule ended in 1979 when Tanzanian forces, alongside Ugandan exiles, invaded and overthrew him after he attempted to annex part of Tanzania. Amin fled to Saudi Arabia, where he lived in exile until his death in 2003. Jean-Bedel Bokassa. Jean-Bedel Bokassa seized power in 1966 through a coup and ruled the Central African Republic, CAR, as a dictator before declaring himself Emperor Bokassa I in 1976. His reign was marked by extreme brutality, corruption, and delusions of grandeur. He spent a third of the country's budget on a lavish coronation in 1977, modeled after Napoleon's, complete with a diamond-encrusted crown costing $20 million while his people starved. He operated like a mad king, personally beating and executing opponents, and was accused of cannibalism. Some witnesses claimed he kept human flesh in his freezer. His rule became infamous for the massacre of over 100 schoolchildren in 1979 after they protested against mandatory school uniforms that his government was profiting from. His soldiers rounded up children, locked them in a prison, and brutally killed them. His regime became so chaotic that even his former allies, the French government, turned against him. In 1979, France organized Operation Barracuda and overthrew him, reinstating former President David Dacko. Bokassa fled to exile in Côte d'Ivoire and later France before returning in 1986, where he was arrested and sentenced to death, later reduced to life in prison. He died in 1996, claiming he was the 13th apostle of Jesus before his death. Robert Mugabe. Initially hailed as a liberation hero, Robert Mugabe ruled Zimbabwe for nearly 4 decades with an iron fist, turning from a freedom fighter into a ruthless dictator. His first major crime was the Gukurahundi massacre, 1983 to 1987, where he ordered the killing of over 20,000 Ndebele civilians, accusing them of supporting political opposition. His feared 5th Brigade, trained by North Korea, carried out mass executions, rape, and torture in Matabeleland. Over time, Mugabe eliminated all opposition, rigged elections, and ruled through fear. His most disastrous policy was the 2000 Land Reform Program, where he forcibly seized land from white farmers and redistributed it to his political allies instead of poor Zimbabweans. This led to the collapse of agriculture, hyperinflation reaching 89.7 sextillion% in 2008, and extreme poverty. Zimbabwe's once thriving economy crumbled, forcing millions to flee. Mugabe's wife, Grace Mugabe, looted millions, and he lived in luxury while citizens starved. His rule was also marked by brutal suppression of protests, arbitrary arrests, and media censorship. Eventually, even his own ZANU-PF party turned against him. In 2017, after a military coup, Mugabe was forced to resign at age 93. He lived in luxury until his death in 2019, leaving behind a broken country and a controversial legacy. Omar al-Bashir. Omar al-Bashir came to power in 1989 through a military coup, overthrowing the democratic government of Sudan. His rule was characterized by brutality, war crimes, and genocide, particularly in the Darfur region. In the early 2000s, Bashir's government launched a campaign of ethnic cleansing in Darfur, where his forces and the Janjaweed militia killed an estimated 300,000 people and displaced over 2.5 million. Women and girls were raped on a mass scale, and entire villages were burned. His Islamist policies also led to decades of civil war, culminating in the secession of South Sudan in 2011. Despite Sudan's vast oil wealth, Bashir embezzled billions, while the country remained impoverished. His regime also harbored terrorists, including Osama bin Laden in the 1990s, leading to international sanctions. In 2009, the International Criminal Court, ICC, issued an arrest warrant for Bashir, making him the first sitting head of state to be indicted for genocide. His downfall came in 2019 when mass protests erupted due to economic collapse and decades of oppression. The military arrested him, and he now faces trial for war crimes and corruption. Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor was one of Africa's most notorious warlords before becoming Liberia's president in 1997. He started Liberia's first civil war, 1889-1996, by leading a rebel group, the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, NPFL, that massacred civilians, used child soldiers, and fueled chaos. He won the presidency in 1997 through fear, using his infamous slogan, "He killed my ma, he killed my pa, but I will vote for him." His presidency did not bring peace. Instead, he continued looting Liberia's resources and destabilized neighboring Sierra Leone by arming the brutal Revolutionary United Front, RUF, in exchange for blood diamonds. The RUF committed horrific war crimes, including mutilations, mass rape, and forcing children to execute their own parents. Under his rule, Liberia's economy collapsed while he enriched himself. In 2003, international pressure and a second civil war forced him to resign, and he fled to Nigeria. In 2012, he became the first African leader to be convicted of war crimes, receiving a 50-year prison sentence for aiding war crimes in Sierra Leone. His legacy remains one of destruction, leaving Liberia and Sierra Leone in ruins. Sani Abacha. Sani Abacha seized power in 1993 through a military coup, ruling Nigeria with iron-fisted dictatorship, corruption, and human rights abuses. His rule was characterized by state-sponsored assassinations, media suppression, and brutal crackdowns on dissent. He established death squads that eliminated political opponents, including journalist Dele Giwa and activists who spoke out against him. One of his most notorious crimes was the execution of environmental activist Kensaro Wiwa and 8 other Ogoni leaders in 1995, despite international outcry. This led to Nigeria's suspension from the Commonwealth. Abacha's regime also looted the country on an unprecedented scale, embezzling over $4 billion, with much of it stashed in Swiss and foreign bank accounts, later known as the Abacha loot. Under his mismanagement, Nigeria's economy suffered, and the country remained under oppressive military rule. His regime was infamous for arbitrary arrests, forced disappearances, and the use of torture on political prisoners. In 1998, Abacha mysteriously died, reportedly of a heart attack while with prostitutes, though some suspect poisoning. His sudden death paved the way for Nigeria's return to democracy, but his corruption and brutality left a dark legacy. Mobutu Sese Seko. Mobutu Sese Seko took power in 1965 through a coup, backed by the US and Belgium, after the assassination of Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba, which the CIA played a role in. He established a brutal kleptocracy, where he ruled Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, as his personal empire. He amassed a fortune of over $5 billion by siphoning off the country's wealth, while the Congolese people suffered in poverty. Under his authenticity campaign, he renamed the country Zaire, forced citizens to adopt African names, and banned Western suits in favor of traditional clothing, while he himself wore leopard skin hats and expensive European clothes. He ruled through intimidation, political repression, and absolute power, crushing dissent and executing opponents. He created a cult of personality, forcing people to chant slogans like "Mobutu is eternal," and broadcast his image constantly on state TV. His secret police tortured and killed those who opposed him. Meanwhile, he allowed the country's infrastructure to decay, looted state funds, and used foreign aid to enrich himself. His downfall began in the 1990s when rebels led by Laurent Désiré Kabila, with support from neighboring Rwanda and Uganda, launched a military campaign against him. In 1997, Mobutu fled into exile in Morocco, where he died of cancer the same year. His corrupt legacy left Zaire in economic and social ruin, leading to decades of instability and war. Francisco Macias Nguema. Francisco Macias Nguema was the first president of Equatorial Guinea after its independence from Spain in 1968, but his rule quickly descended into one of the most brutal dictatorships in African history. Obsessed with power and paranoia, he declared himself president for life in 1972, banning all opposition and ruling with terror. He ordered the mass execution of political opponents, intellectuals, and anyone he considered a threat. His government wiped out a third of the country's population. An estimated 80,000 people were either killed or fled the country. He especially targeted the educated class, leading to the closure of schools and universities. Macias Nguema outlawed Christianity, banned the use of Western medicine, and forced people to refer to him as the unique miracle. He had such extreme paranoia that he moved the national treasury to his house and ruled from a small remote village instead of the capital. His regime became so chaotic that even his own family turned against him. In 1979, his nephew, Teodoro Obiang Nguema, led a military coup, capturing and sentencing him to death by firing squad. His reign left Equatorial Guinea in economic and social ruin, with his nephew taking over and ruling the country to this day. Mengistu Haile Mariam. Mengistu Haile Mariam led Ethiopia under a Marxist-Leninist military dictatorship from 1977 to 1991 after overthrowing Emperor Haile Selassie. His rule was infamous for the Red Terror campaign, 1977 to 1978, where over 500,000 people were killed in a brutal crackdown on political opponents. His government executed dissidents, intellectuals, students, and anyone suspected of being anti-regime. Victims were often tortured, shot, or thrown into mass graves, with their families forced to pay for the bullets used in their execution. Mengistu also oversaw forced collectivization policies that led to famine, contributing to the 1983 to 1985 Ethiopian famine that killed over 1 million people. While the country starved, Mengistu lived lavishly, throwing extravagant parties and ruling with absolute power. His military dictatorship lasted until 1991, when rebel forces overthrew him, forcing him to flee to Zimbabwe, where he was granted asylum by Robert Mugabe. In 2007, an Ethiopian court sentenced him to death in absentia for genocide, but he remains in exile, unpunished, despite one of the bloodiest regimes in Africa's history. Daniel Arap Moi. Daniel Arap Moi ruled Kenya for 24 years after taking over from Jomo Kenyatta in 1978. His rule was marked by corruption, human rights abuses, and suppression of democracy. He quickly turned Kenya into a one-party state, where opposition was banned, critics were jailed, and media was censored. His regime brutally crushed dissent, using the special branch police to torture and detain opposition leaders, students, and activists. One of the worst crackdowns was the 1982 coup attempt, after which thousands of military officers and civilians were arrested, tortured, and executed. Moi's government was infamous for Nyayo House torture chambers, where detainees were beaten, electrocuted, and starved for speaking out against the regime. He also looted billions of dollars from Kenya, with the Goldenberg scandal alone costing Kenya nearly $1 billion. His corrupt policies led to economic collapse, high unemployment, and increased poverty. Moi rigged multiple elections, but growing resistance led to his downfall. In 2002, under pressure, he finally stepped down, leaving behind a legacy of brutality, economic ruin, and mass human rights violations. He died in 2020, but many victims of his regime never received justice. P.W. Botha. Botha was South Africa's last hardline apartheid leader, ruling from 1978 to 1989, and was responsible for some of the worst human rights abuses under apartheid. He intensified racial segregation, police brutality, and political repression, using the state security forces to crush anti-apartheid movements. Under his rule, the police and military carried out assassinations, torture, and forced disappearances of black activists. His government funded hit squads that targeted members of the African National Congress, ANC, and other resistance groups. Botha also expanded the use of detention without trial, leading to thousands of political prisoners, including children. The 1985 state of emergency saw mass killings of protesters, with the police given shoot-to-kill orders. His government was also responsible for biological and chemical warfare programs aimed at black South Africans. Despite international pressure, Botha refused to end apartheid, increasing South Africa's global isolation. His unwillingness to reform led to his ousting in 1989, paving the way for negotiations that ultimately ended apartheid. He never apologized for his crimes and lived in luxury until his death in 2006, avoiding any punishment for his brutal and racist policies. I know you were expecting more video like this. So, hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world, and it helps me bringing you more content.